Good evening. I'd like to thank everyone for virtually attending the 40th National Student Symposium. As Symposium Chair, it is my pleasure to introduce Grant Strobel, the Joseph Story Award Chair at the University of Chicago Law School, who will tell you about both the Story Award and this year's distinguished recipient.
Thank you so much, Eric, and good evening. In 1985, Attorney General Ed Meese gave a groundbreaking speech before the American Bar Association in what became the first public defense of originalism by a sitting Attorney General. In that speech, General Meese highlighted Joseph's story. He described Joseph's story as, quote, a lawyer's everyman, a lawyer, justice, and teacher of law. Justice Story, also, of course, happened to have a theory of judging that General Meese and the Federalist Society thought merited reconsideration, originalism. But it was in the spirit of being a lawyer's everyman at an early stage in life that the Story Award gets its name. The Joseph Story Award is given annually to a young academic who has demonstrated excellence in legal scholarship, a commitment to teaching, a concern for students, and who has made a significant public impact in a manner that advances the rule of law in a free society. In other words, a budding lawyer's everyman. I am excited to announce this year's Everyman and Joseph Story Award winner, Professor Aaron Nielsen of Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School. Professor Nielsen exemplifies all of the characteristics of a winner of the Joseph Story Award. First, Professor Nielsen is the embodiment of excellence in legal scholarship. He has written dozens of articles on administrative law, included widely cited pieces on deference and a thoughtful piece on the upside of ossification, what he calls sticky regulations. In addition, he was appointed by the US Supreme Court to brief and argue Collin versus Yellen, a separation of powers case about the Federal Housing Finance Agency. You could tell he is a man with a sense of duty from his exemplary briefing and poise during oral arguments. We also see his commitment to public service as chair of the Administrative and Management Committee of the Administrative Conference of the United States and on the Council of the ABA's Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice section. And lastly, as a law teacher, he shows his concern for students through his outstanding character. One student noted, quote, his door has always been open to me and my peers, and he eagerly helps all students secure employment, understand the law, or rediscover hope. When the father of one of my friends and fellow classmates passed away of cancer, Professor Nielsen called him and offered help. As this student concluded, quote, Aaron Nielsen is that kind of man, professor, lawyer, and leader. A lawyer, teacher, and litigator before the Supreme Court, Professor Nielsen is a lawyer's everyman, deserving of the Joseph Story Award. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this award. I don't feel worthy of an award named for Justice Story, and the list of past recipients is more than a little intimidating. This is a true honor. I've been a member of the Federalist Society since my first semester of law school. I've often thought about why that is. A few weeks ago, however, I was reminded in a place where answers to many of life's most important questions are found, the comment section of a blog. At Prof's blog, a professor posted an article that said, quote, the implicit goal of all argument is ultimately to vanquish the opposing view, end quote. The article is worth reading. It offers a perspective on counterspeech that I've not seen before. The post, however, had comments, including one from a past recipient of this award, Professor Orrin Kerr. Here is part of what he said. As for the idea that the implicit goal of all argument is ultimately to vanquish the opposing view, I couldn't disagree more. I think the point of argument is to search for truth. We make claims as best we can see them, to test them, to see if we are right, with the goal of being proven wrong if we are wrong. If we make bad arguments, we should be delighted to be shown wrong. We should want to lose arguments if we are on the wrong side, as that is the only way we improve our ideas. That comment reminded me of what I admire about the Federalist Society. First, no one has a monopoly on wisdom, and when we're mistaken, we should be happy to be corrected. I love that the Federalist Society encourages debate. Operationalized for you, student chapters, the goal should be to invite speakers with something important to say, but also respondents who can offer not just a response, but the best possible version of the response. Real learning requires good faith consideration of ideas, and when it is really humming, the Federalist Society is great at facilitating those exchanges. Second, I appreciated that Professor Kerr spoke up. When we are wrong, we should admit it, but we are not always wrong, and we need to be willing to say what we think. And just because some ideas are unpopular or peculiar doesn't mean that they are wrong. I learned a lot about how the world works from my grandparents, none of whom went to law school, but who lived wonderful lives in very small towns in Utah and Idaho. Watching speakers at Federalist Society events has encouraged me to speak up too. And third, Professor Kerr engaged politely. All too often, popular culture seems to say that because we are in a war of ideas, there is no time for measured conversation. But politeness is an idea. The idea is that we need to build institutions and social norms that allow new ideas to emerge. We should be respectful because it is the right thing to do. But if that isn't good enough, we should be respectful anyway, because madness lies in any other direction. When it is at its best, the Federalist Society models measured, thoughtful conversation. I don't always live up to these ideals, and neither do you, and neither, frankly, does the Federalist Society. But those ideals are important, and the Federalist Society is a place where those ideals are welcome. And we should all want to be where those ideals are welcome. Many sincere thanks again for this award and for all the work that student chapters do to make the Federalist Society what it is. Thank you.
Great. Thank you and congratulations again, Professor. My name is Jonathan Sargent. I'm the Vice President of the Penn Law Federalist Society, and I have the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker today. First, I want to thank everyone for staying with us for yesterday and today. And second, as just a logistical matter, please save all of your questions for our keynote speaker until after the speech. You can type them into the chat box and I'll go through them at the end. So I'm going to try my very best to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Mike Lee, a difficult task given his career thus far. For anyone who has followed Senator Lee's career, you've known that his appreciation for the Constitution started at a young age, watching his father, Rex Lee, President Reagan's Solicitor General, deliver arguments before the Supreme Court. He would later go on to deliver nearly 60 arguments over the course of his lifetime. It should come as no surprise that Senator Lee would follow in his footsteps and attend law school, attending BYU Law. He would later serve as a law clerk to Judge Benson on the of the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah, and then with future Supreme Court Justice Judge Samuel Alito on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Senator Lee would then spend several years as attorney with Sidley Austin, serve as an assistant U.S. attorney in Salt Lake City, would serve in Governor Huntsman's General Counsel's office, and would later be united with now Justice Alito for a one-year clerkship at the Supreme Court. He was then elected by the citizens of Utah to serve in the U.S. Senate in 2010. In the Senate, he serves the lead Republic on the Joint Economic Committee, on the Energy and Natural Resources Subcommittee on Public Lands, Forests, and Mining, and as a ranking Republican on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights, where I have the honor to serve as one of his law clerks for this spring semester. Throughout his career, Senator Lee has earned a reputation as an outstanding practitioner of the law based on his sound judgment, abilities in the courtroom, and thorough understanding of the Constitution. We at the Penn Law Federalist Society are honored to have him as our keynote speaker. And without further ado, I want to welcome Senator Mike Lee.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And thanks for your willingness to both serve as a member of my team. We really enjoy working with you, and for your invitation to speak tonight. It really is an honor and a pleasure to do this. It seems like just yesterday, when I was attending the National Student Symposium while I was in law school, while I was the the president of BYU's student chapter of the Federalist Society. Today, I have my son holds that distinction. My son James is the president of the BYU Federalist Society, and my son John is a first year, while James is in his third year. So the Federalist Society is something of a longstanding tradition in our family, and something that we're very pleased to be a part of. Federalist Society events really are some of my favorite events every year. I went to my very first Federalist Society event when I was still in high school. We found out that Robert Bork was speaking just a few miles from my high school. And so as the president of the Teenage Republican Club, yes, I really was that much of a nerd then. I organized a trip. We were able to get out of class for a few hours to go hear Robert Bork speak. It was fantastic. But listen, it really is a treat. It's not every day that I get to nerd out with fellow Federalist Society members from across the country on constitutional law, on any other topic. And my only regret today is that we can't all be together for this event. Hopefully, COVID willing and God willing, we'll be able to get back to some sense of normalcy in our country by the time this event occurs next year. All right, so you've invited me to speak at this symposium, and at a symposium specifically focusing on international law. I found this challenging and greatly amusing, because I'm pretty sure inviting me to speak at a symposium about international law is kind of like inviting an atheist to preach at your church, and that might be understating the matter. I haven't been a big fan of international law, in part because I think people misuse the term, in part because the term itself maybe fails to capture what actually does the work of being a law, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more tonight. But I don't know much about international law. I don't purport to have any expertise in this area, but I do know a thing or two about the Constitution and about our founding fathers' vision of government. And I know a thing or two also about UN conventions, about the difference between public international law and customary international law. And I think that these things are best understood against the backdrop of the Constitution. And I think, as with so many other things, the founders and what they wrote in the Constitution offers us some real wisdom and insights in the area of what we might call international law. There's a common thread that runs through our Constitution in what our system of government and our system of law should look like when they're properly functioning. That is, in how our government is structured to keep its power close to and accountable to the people, in the hands of a free people. And that's the context in which I'd like to speak to you today. So let's talk about international law and what it means and what it doesn't mean. In order to explore that topic, we've got to begin with a discussion of what law is. Laws, as they are best understood, I think are norms. A norm becomes a law when it's backed up by a legitimate government actor that has the physical wherewithal to enforce it and the legitimacy of a sovereign government. That's part of how we distinguish cartels, or for that matter, self-proclaimed sovereign citizens, from states or from any other form of government. Now, in the international realm, this same principle that laws are backed up by the legitimate use of collective coercive force is why people like me tend to get worried when we start talking about international law, because it begs all sorts of questions. If a law is a norm legitimately enforced by force, it begs the question, first of all, legitimately enforced by whom? There is no worldwide government, thankfully, mercifully. And the United Nations, the only body that would probably want to lay claim to that, and the only body that many people might assume has that status, is itself a non-starter. Now, look, it's not something that we can ever recognize as a government. China and Russia, for example, sit on the Security Council, and Pakistan sits on the Human Rights Council. But nevertheless, the term international law can be useful in some areas. For instance, in the realm of trade, we've seen there are countless instances in which we've agreed to enforce certain laws according to a set of agreed upon international standards. For instance, as a member of the World Trade Organization, we've signed on to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in which we've committed to eliminating or reducing tariffs and quotas on certain goods in exchange for similar reciprocal agreements from other countries. Bilateral investment treaties amount to another example of this kind of international agreement. We get protection in a certain country for our investors in exchange for offering protection to investors from that country. With NATO, for example, we've committed to a common defense strategy with other member nations by providing funds, technology, and of course, troops, and all of the equipment that goes along with those things. And Congress maintains a firm hand in the governance of our obligations under NATO, including oversight of burden sharing requirements, declaring war in the event that the Article 5 mutual defense requirement of NATO is invoked, and Senate ratification is required for us to add any new member states to NATO. The NATO Treaty preserves each member nation's sovereignty and necessitates domestic laws, the domestic laws of each and every member nation, and requires them to implement the common defense commitments that are made. In this respect, our commitment to international law, and as it's manifested in things like our NATO obligations, is reminiscent of something that we learned back in the 1740s. Benjamin Franklin learned from an Iroquois Indian chief of the Onondaga tribe named Canasatego. They both attended a conference in Albany in 1744. And at one point, they got to talking about how the Iroquois Confederacy had been so successful and how it had maintained its strength while allowing each of the member nations within the Iroquois Confederacy to maintain its own identity. He explained it by referring to a bundle of arrows. It's very easy for one person to take a single arrow and break it. But you take 5 or 6 of those, each representing one of the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. You bind them together, and it's very, very difficult for any one person to break. And so Canasatego explained to Benjamin Franklin, way back in 1744, this principle that you really can allow an entire country to form. Now, fortunately, we don't want our NATO obligations to result in the formation of a country. We want each individual nation that's a member of it to maintain its own sovereignty. We're not really outsourcing our sovereignty there. We're not becoming a single nation, but we can join together for certain broader purposes. And we can do that, especially appropriately under our constitutional system, as long as those obligations that we undertake through that or any other treaty are backed up by something in our domestic legal system to make it legitimate. In some instances, however, we use the term international law to refer to a whole host of things that really aren't, or at least in my view, shouldn't be considered law. We dumb down the word law in a dangerous way when we use the word law where it doesn't actually apply. Let's take, for example, international agreements. The Paris Climate Agreement is a great example of this. It was signed with great fanfare by many nations, including environmental luminaries like China and like Iran, and was signed on behalf of the United States by President Obama. Here's the secret about the Paris Agreement. It doesn't mean anything. It at least not insofar as our laws are concerned. It has some very nice sounding language about being a legally binding international treaty on climate change. But as far as we are concerned, in the United States of America, it does not have the force of law. Even before President Trump got us out of it, it wasn't really law. In fact, it's an insult to law to call it that. I'm sure laws everywhere, to the extent they have emotions, to the extent they have a perception of themselves, feel suddenly threatened. They feel an existential crisis when someone refers to the Paris Climate Agreement as a law, because it's an insult to all laws everywhere to call it that. If a party to the Paris Climate Agreement, let's say China, signed the agreement and then carried on emitting CO2 as if nothing ever happened, surprise to everyone, right? There would be no consequence whatsoever, which is exactly what China has done, by the way. Here's another one. At least insofar as we're concerned, the same description applies to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is the kind of international law that I loathe. I mean, absolutely loathe. I consider it evil, not just evil, but evil, as in the fruits of the devil, because it is something else masquerading as law. It's not just different than law, it's the opposite of law. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea creates an entity called the International Seabed Authority, headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica, that would mandate royalties, primarily from oil and gas extraction, to be paid to the International Seabed Authority, based in Kingston, Jamaica, and, quote, equitably distributed among member states, but with special priority given to developing and landlocked nations. Now, tell me how that makes sense to begin with. Now, if you're thinking, by the way, that this provision that I just described sounds an awful lot like a tax, well, you'd be correct. And if you're thinking that it sounds like a socialistic model of forcing redistribution of wealth from one group of countries to another, well, you'd also be correct. And if you're thinking also that this is something that would inevitably result in increased consumer prices, inuring disproportionately to the detriment of poor and middle-class people in the United States and in basically every other nation, without really being able to perceive the harm that was being sent their way through this agreement, you'd be correct in that too. Participation in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea would also require the United States to request permission from the International Seabed Authority before engaging in deep seabed mining activities in our own continental seabeds. Now, while you ponder that for a minute, consider the fact that China is a member, and China regularly ignores it. Back in 2016, an international tribunal known as the International Court of Justice. I've got a bone to pick with that title, by the way. I would much prefer that we referred to it as the International Tribunal of something or other. I think to call it a court in our country presupposes certain things that don't apply there, but let's set that aside for a minute. So this entity called the International Court of Justice ruled against China's claims in the South China Sea back in 2016. Now, China didn't even show up to the trial, and then it continued on as if nothing had ever happened. Ratification of this treaty, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, would require a massive delegation of US sovereignty and the imposition of a new tax on the American people. And because I took an oath to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, and because I'm still convinced that committing the United States to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea would be a violation of my oath, I opposed it. I've opposed it basically the entire 10-year period since I've been in the United States Senate. Mercifully, they haven't brought it back up again for a while. It really is that bad. By the way, one other thing I'd like to add on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This doesn't have much of a legal impact, but I think it's worth mentioning that the acronym that's used to abbreviate it, people in the know, will refer to it by its initials, UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, any sane, rational person would look at that and in English conclude that the the proper pronunciation of that abbreviated acronym would be either UNCLOS or UNCLOS or UNCLOS, something like that, but no. And I kid you not, I have it on good authority that those in the know call it UNSLOS. That really has nothing to do with my comments tonight, other than the fact that it's deeply disturbing that anyone would look at the words UNCLOS and conclude that that should be pronounced UNSLOS. These are some of the same people who would pronounce the word negotiate. Just don't do it. Don't ever let yourself fall into that trap. All right, so you've got faux treaties like UNSLOS that we haven't ratified and that people are still trying to get ratified under the guise that we have to do it because, and I've heard this argument many times. I've heard it by people from the Pentagon, by admirals. We need it because we need a seat at the table. I find that a completely indefensible argument in favor of something that would necessarily, unavoidably allow for the deterioration of U.S. sovereignty with no legitimate purpose. Anyway, let's move on beyond the faux law unratified treaties. Let's go to what I might regard as perhaps the worst offender of all, customary international law. Now, look, I don't mean any offense to anyone who loves customary international law. I get it. I understand your passion. It's just that I really don't like it because I think a lot of bad can be done with it. But no disrespect to you if you feel this way. But let me explain what I mean. Now, public international law is based on treaties. At least there, we're talking about a legal document that a sovereign state has agreed to abide by. And to the extent that we have ratified treaties, yeah, we have agreed to abide by them. But customary international law is altogether different. Scholars define it as general principles of that are common to the major legal systems, even if not incorporated or reflected in customary law or international agreement. Let's back that up a little bit. What the heck does that mean? I mean, which legal systems, which major legal systems are we talking about? General principles as defined by whom? This kind of language sets off all of the emanation and penumbra alarm bells for me. And if there's one warning that we should all keep with us always is don't emanate into the penumbra. I'm grateful to Justice Thomas for the fact that he's got this fantastic sign. It's printed out like a traffic sign in his office in Washington. And it says, please do not emanate into the penumbra. A few years ago, I was driving to work one day in Washington and I saw Justice Thomas. I think he was leaving, had just come from religious services, walking back to the Supreme Court. And I couldn't resist the temptation to roll down my window and say, please don't emanate into the penumbra. And he responded in his characteristically enthusiastic baritone voice, I won't. And believe me, I won't because I know you'll write a book about me. Long story. All right. Let's talk for a minute about sovereignty and how that relates to our own system of domestic laws and our legislative power. What's the through line here? What's the common thread? What is it that distinguishes the Paris Agreement and UNSLOS on the one hand from NATO on the other hand? Well, it's sovereignty. The United States Congress never ratified the Paris Agreement or UNSLOS. For our purposes, they are dead letter. NATO and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, by contrast, have been ratified by the Senate and are embedded into U.S. law through enabling legislation. So at the end of the day, if we're talking about international law, that is in fact law. We're really talking about domestic law, at least for our purposes as American lawyers, talking about the American legal system. Insofar as we are concerned, for something to be actual international law that is going to affect us and our country, it's got to be backed up by something, giving it legitimacy within our domestic legal system. Why? Well, again, this gets back to the fact that there is no global government. And I hope and pray that there never will be a global government on Earth. It would be a horrendous thing in my view. Regardless, there is not now. Now, it is certainly the case that policy and principles that undergird international agreements that have not been ratified by the Senate could become part of U.S. domestic law if legislation were introduced, debated, and enacted, being passed by both houses of Congress and then presented to the president for his signature or veto. However, while a nuanced distinction, it's important to note that Congress could not pass legislation that submits the United States to the whims and the powers of a decision-making or dispute resolution body, at least not without the ratification of a treaty by a 2/3 supermajority vote of the Senate. The reason for this distinction is sovereignty, binding the United States of America to following the rules and subsequent consequences of an international authority is itself an explicit surrender of a portion of our sovereignty. The benefits and the costs of such an act must always be weighed. And thus, why the Senate is the body vested with the power to either ratify or reject the treaties. You see, because you got to have 2/3 of a body in which all the states are equally represented, each with 2 senators in order to get there. That's no accident. That's what it requires. It is a very, very significant threshold. The American people have consented to be bound by these agreements through the decisions of their elected representatives. That's exactly why the International Seabed Authority under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea doesn't and shouldn't, and I hope will never have the right to make laws for us. Only Congress has that right. And in the absence either of Congress enacting through legislation, something that would do that, or in the case of a treaty that would need to be ratified, 2/3 of the Senate doing it, then UNSLOS has no power here. The Constitution vested the power to make law in Congress. Article 1, Section 1, the very first clause of the first section of the first article of the Constitution, provides that all legislative powers here granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. It's no accident that this appeared very first. You see, the founding fathers knew that it was very, very important that the most dangerous power within the federal government, that is to make law, to establish norms carrying the force of generally applicable law that could be executed, implemented, and enforced with the powerful sovereign entity that is the United States of America, should be entrusted only to the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. And so as a result of that, you can't make law without going through Congress. So one of the reasons I'm opposed to the lazy, haphazard, and extremely disturbingly casual way in which people often talk about international law is because we repeat some of these same mistakes when we adopt law in violation of the spirit and or the letter of the non-delegation principle. This is just another realm in which Congress delegates its rightful, and I believe it's completely non-delegable lawmaking authority to the executive branch. We can't do that. We can't delegate it to the president or to ambassadors or even worse, foreign governments or international institutions. This tendency shows up all over the place in the foreign policy context. Now, I want to talk for a minute about exactly how this plays out in the war powers realm. The founding fathers were very careful in the way they established parameters around our nation's war powers. After the tyranny that we had experienced under the mother country, culminating in the tyrannical acts of King George III, which the founding generation suffered both as subjects and as soldiers, the framers were keen to avoid a dangerous and kingly concentration of power in the hands of one, or alternatively in the hands of a few people. As James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson in 1798, he said, quote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature," close quote. So in Article 1, Section 8, they placed the power to declare war in Congress, the branch where open and public debate would happen, the branch where the people making decisions would most easily and quickly be held accountable by the people, to the people at regular intervals. In other words, if you make a stupid decision in Congress, especially if it's about a very consequential stupid decision in Congress, then odds are pretty good you might get fired over it in the next 2 years. If you're in the House of Representatives, you're up every 2 years. If you're in the Senate, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. And you've got to have both the House and the Senate in order to make war. That's a pretty good way of holding people's feet to the fire. Now, let's talk about how this affects the treaty power and how it relates to it. The founders entrusted the Senate with treaty ratification and with providing advice and consent on the president's ambassadorial nominees and all other nominees for that matter. They were intentionally crafted as shared powers by the founders because they understood the dangers of vesting the full power of foreign relations in the hands of one powerful individual, especially if the full power included the power to take us to war. Alexander Hamilton understood that the unique status of treaties as both international agreement and domestic law made the legislative branch's involvement crucial, even indispensable. In Federalist number 75, he wrote that the qualities elsewhere detailed as indispensable in the management of foreign negotiations point out the executive as the most fit agent in those transactions, that is, making treaties, while the vast importance of the trust and the operation of treaties as laws pleads strongly for the participation of the whole or a portion of the legislative body in the office of making them, close quote. Hamilton also explained this in Federalist 69. He explained a similar principle, explaining that this was one of the distinguishing characteristics, one of the key distinctions between our constitutional system under our Constitution and the system from which we had broken with the Revolution. That is the English Constitution. Although their Constitution doesn't appear in one single place, they use that term much more broadly to refer to basically custom and practice. And he noted that under the English system, the monarch had the power to take us to war. This ended tragically, not just in the loss of tears, but also treasure and blood over and over and over again, because the king could take us to war. It was then Parliament's job to just figure out how to pay for it. And as a result, the king, who couldn't be voted out of office, could do all kinds of bad things, always leading to the incremental expansion of government at the expense of individual liberty, and with immense loss of blood and treasure. And that's why we didn't trust this power to be put in the hands of the executive. The power to make treaties, to select who represents the United States abroad, in the form of ambassadors, to commit the United States to obligations and alliances with other nations, and to wage war, all have enormous impacts on the well-being of our republic. The use or abuse of these powers can expand the nation's prosperity and security and influence abroad, or trigger the decline of all of those very same things. And they do when we mess up. That's exactly why it's so important that the Senate provide vigorous debate on those decisions and provide a check on the human impulses that might otherwise take us in a bad direction. Yet in the modern era, Congress, and specifically the Senate, shies away from exercising, from fully exerting its full authority, choosing simply to delegate this responsibility over to the executive branch. Now, what's the result of this delegation of powers, you may ask? Consider the treaty power. Now, the Constitution requires that the president submit the treaty to the Senate for ratification, and that the Senate must debate and choose to ratify or reject based on a 2/3 supermajority threshold. And yet today, the Senate relatively rarely, quite rarely, receives treaties for consideration. In fact, a few years ago, when the so-called JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, was being brought forward for our consideration, then Secretary of State, the Obama administration at the time refused to submit it for ratification. And then Secretary of State John Kerry came before one of my committees, and I asked him why. The reason surprised me, because it was a really bad reason. He said, well, we didn't think that it was appropriate for us to submit it to you as a treaty for ratification, you see, because it's not just one country, it's lots of countries. And it's not just countries that signed on to it, it's also other groups that are not nations. So we just didn't do it. Well, at the time, I happened to have up on my phone the definition from the State Department's own website that, at the time at least, defined treaties to include such things. He offered, in different circumstances, and when we pushed back on him, other, let's say, less than persuasive defenses. One of which was, well, we didn't think that the Senate would ratify it, and so we didn't. Well, that's exactly the whole point. When you know you don't have the votes to submit something as a treaty for ratification, you shouldn't try to ram it through. So meanwhile, as we've been going through this, we've had presidents continuing to commit the United States to an ugly, smelly smorgasbord of international commitments, like the Paris Climate Agreement, like the JCPOA, again, the Iran nuclear deal, agreements to join the UN Human Rights Council and the World Health Organizations, all without submitting those agreements to the Senate for ratification. But there's little appetite in Congress to restrain the executive from foisting broad international commitments on the American people, despite our constitutional obligation to check this power. The result, well, de facto rule in some circumstances by foreign powers. Here, it's worth remembering George Washington's startling, prescient warning in his farewell address. He said, quote, "Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government." I love George Washington. It's a fantastic quote from him. And I thank him there in particular for properly referring to our form of government as a republic. But I digress. Let's get back to the importance of the legislative branch and Congress reclaiming legislative powers. This is absolutely essential for us to restore public trust and legitimacy in our government, to protect our liberty. Our Constitution created these twin structural protections that themselves are at the very heart, at the very center of what it means to have a system of constitutionally limited government. They are as important as any other feature, as important as any one of the Bill of Rights protections. In fact, without these structural protections, none of the Bill of Rights protections would mean anything. As Justice Scalia used to say, any tin-horn dictator around the world can have a Bill of Rights. In fact, most tin-horn dictators do have a glowing Bill of Rights, one that rivals or in some cases exceeds our Bill of Rights in terms of the lofty language that is used to describe the rights of individual citizens. Now, Justice Scalia never explained what the difference might be between a tin-horn dictator and a regular non-tin-horn dictator. I don't really know what the difference is. I intended to ask him. Figure out that answer, that's great. But his point is this. His point was always that what makes the difference between the tin-horn dictator's Bill of Rights and ours is the existence of structural protections. We've got the horizontal protection of separation of powers, saying that within the federal government, we're going to have three separate branches: a legislative branch, Congress, that makes the laws; the executive branch, headed by the president, that executes and implements and enforces the laws; and the judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress may by law establish, that interprets the laws where people disagree as to their meaning. Those structural protections are designed to implement our system in a way that will limit the power of government and thereby expand and protect the space in which we, the people, pursue our happiness together. That is, they understood something that I think has kind of been lost among many in Washington in recent years, which is that government power doesn't just come from nothing. Government power expands only at the expense of individual liberty. It doesn't mean it's bad necessarily when government expands. It doesn't mean that it's bad to have government. It just means it's not a cost-free proposition. The Founding Fathers understood this, and they understood that if the purpose of government were in fact the happiness of the people, as it is and always should be, then success should depend on diffusing power so that no individual or faction could get too much of it or misuse it. That logic is no less valid in the foreign policy realm. The case for congressional control over American war making is roughly the same as the case for congressional control over federal policy making writ large. That is, it's a case for dispersing political power, placing it in the most diverse, representative, and regularly accountable branch of government suited to that task. It's not a coincidence that this history of Congress's slow motion surrender of its constitutional role in making war and international relations mirrors its surrender of domestic policymaking authority. They both stem from the same watershed sin. That is, they both stem from Congress's self-serving, bipartisan, and shameful retreat from constitutional responsibility. You see, this drift hasn't happened as much as I wish I could say otherwise. It hasn't happened exclusively through one party. No, this has happened through the failed leadership over the last 85 years of Senates, Houses of Representatives, and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination. You see, the real reason Congress defers to the executive branch on questions of foreign relations and domestic policy has nothing to do with the exigencies of modern political or military technocracy. It's just easier to engage in rank punditry than it is to make hard decisions for which you'll ultimately be held accountable by the people. It's tough. Making laws is a tough exercise, and that's why people tend to avoid it. This is the part that James Madison didn't entirely foresee. He foresaw a lot of things. He predicted that, power would be made to counteract and counterbalance power, and that within our system of government, within each branch of government, and between the federal government and states and localities, there would be this natural tension that would help keep things balanced. What I think he didn't entirely anticipate is that at the same time, we started deviating dangerously from federalism and separation of powers, turning the elegantly constructed sort of pyramid structure of the vertical protection of federalism on its head, so that rather than the powers of the federal government being few and divine, and those of the states numerous and indefinite, we've now adopted a federal system in which the federal powers are numerous and indefinite, and those reserved to the states are increasingly becoming few and defined. This is the beauty, though, of Article 1. When Congress is in charge of making laws, ultimately the American people are in charge of Washington. Thus, if we can just restore the lawmaking power, whether we're talking about strictly domestic law or whether we're talking about so-called international law, or ideally both, if you put the power within the federal government, within the right branch of government, ultimately there's going to be a better balance all the way around, because you won't have any one group of people or any one person acquiring too much authority. That's why it's so important for Congress to reclaim its Article 1 powers and not to delegate out to the executive branch, to ambassadors, to foreign kings, princes, and potentates or international bodies. We don't want to live under the tyranny of a king. And we certainly don't want to live under the tyranny of an international oligarchy in Brussels, in Paris, in Vienna, or in Kingston. No, we can do better than that. And we've adopted a system that guarantees better than that. The restoration of constitutional balance through Congress's reclamation of its rightful role in domestic and foreign policy making is not just one choice among many paths towards stability. No, it's America's only path. So for any of you who happen to agree with me tonight, please join me in this noble cause. Let's reconstitutionalize the federal government to put the American people back in charge of foreign policy and domestic policy alike. We can do this. Together, we can, we must, and we will. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator. That was definitely a great keynote speech. And as I mentioned before, anyone has a question, please just type in the chat. So one question we received was whether you think executive agreements are ever legitimate and what you think Congress can do in practice to challenge their use.
Yeah, look, if we're talking about executive agreements between nations, if we're talking about some sort of memorandum of understanding that identifies a process by which two leaders, let's say the President of the United States and some foreign leader, are going to agree to meet, that's one thing. I don't have a problem with that. But there is a difference between that and making international commitments that signal that we're going to back up something with US domestic law. That's the moment at which it becomes something that should be adopted by treaty. Or if we don't want to do it that way, there are some circumstances in which we can choose to take on obligations through an act of Congress adopted through the House and Senate and presented to the president for signature or veto. But most of the time, that's not going to be an appropriate strategy if we're deferring some of our authority to a discretionary body, to the discretion of some international body. Anyway, this is a little bit analogous to how I describe the problem with executive rulemaking, executive branch lawmaking, which is to say that there's not really a problem with the U.S. Department of Commerce deciding what time the lights are going to go on and off in the Commerce Department. I have no problem with that. That doesn't necessarily trigger any Article 1 issues. And so if the executive branch wants to decide that on its own, it may do so. But the minute it starts to impose affirmative legal obligations on the American people, then consistent with Article 1, Section 1 and Article 1, Section 7, and the principles articulated in INS v. Chadha, then the minute you ring the legislative bell, if you want to change it, you got to ring it again, which means bicameral passage followed by presentment. Because that's affecting members of the public. It's affecting the rights and the obligations of citizens. There's an analogy there to be drawn with international law. If all of this is doing is, if you've got a memorandum of understanding between two leaders going over the basis for future conversations, that's not something that triggers our treaty responsibilities. But if it's purporting to change our law, you bet, it's got to be ratified.
Now, I should note that came from Levi Bendor, Penn Law graduate, a member of the Federalist Society. So next up is Christopher. So he's a former Marine. He wants the U.S. to have as many international allies as possible, especially in Europe and Asia. Given your bundle of sticks analogy, to make that bundle, e.g. defense treaties, is there no room for compromise in any area for the greater good, such as natural defense, such as the Climate Accords Agreement?
Yeah, look, I want to make sure I understand the question. I think what you're asking me is, in light of the good that can be accomplished through international agreements, shouldn't we, go a little bit soft on the Constitution? I think that's what you're asking. If that's what you're asking, the answer is respectfully, emphatically, no. It's not just in spite of the fact that compromise and building alliances are a good thing. It's because they are a good thing that we owe it to the American people to submit this to the proper decision-making authority. Look, international alliances are not worth the paper they are printed on unless they are adopted and backed up by the American people as our form of government requires. If what you mean by compromise is thwarting the Constitution, I can't support that. We have to remember that in every system, in any legislative body that involves more than one person, compromise is not an end result. It sounds like a nice thing. It is ubiquitous. It is the condition precedent to everything. That is, unless you're in North Korea and your name is Kim Jong-un, or you're in Cuba and your last name is Castro. In those places, you probably don't have to achieve any level of compromise. And basically every other national lawmaking body that any of us know much about, compromise is not an end result. It is an inevitability. The question is not where to compromise, whether to compromise, it's where. And so, no, you can't get around a constitutional requirement just because you yourself, as President of the United States, or as a department head, or as a special envoy to UNSLOS, or whatever it is, you can't just say, well, it's for the greater good, so we're going to ignore the Constitution. I can't accept that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Ben. I'm another Penn Law student. So given that President Biden served as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, are you hopeful that he will be more willing to inform Congress of any major foreign policy decisions?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Look, it's we've got a circumstance right now where President Biden has served in the United States Senate and even after being in the United States Senate, then served for another 8 years as vice president and therefore president of the Senate. He has as much institutional experience with the United States Senate as a member as anyone today alive. He also does have great devotion. Now, I frequently disagree with President Biden, but I'm someone who likes to give credit where credit is due. From what I see of him so far, he's one who is not inclined to thumb his nose at the institution that he's served for so many decades. So yeah, I'm guardedly optimistic about that. I hope that those who surround him will support him in that effort rather than trying to change his mind.
Jack says, your case is well-grounded and well-reasoned. What is your opinion as to how many of your colleagues in the Senate share your views on this topic?
At any given moment, the number is 34. The number is at least 34. In other words, you have all these mathematical thresholds. I remember arguing one time with my late father when I was in junior high. We were doing my algebra homework. I was asking him if I was going to be a lawyer one day, why I would possibly need to learn to do quadratic equations. And I pointed out to him that he doesn't need, he was a lawyer, an appellate litigator, regularly argued cases before the Supreme Court. And I pointed out to him, you don't use math? And he said, yes, I do. I use it every day. And I pointed out to him, all you need to do is be able to count to 5. And he gave me some points for that one. He liked the fact that I've made an accurate representation of the math that he had to achieve in front of the US Supreme Court. But there's a different set of mathematical standards that apply in the United States Senate. You've got the most obvious number is 51. That's what it takes to have a constitutional quorum in the Senate and to pass legislation. In order to pass most legislation, you first have to get to a different threshold of 60 in order to bring debate to a close. The threshold for stopping any treaty from being ratified is 34. So if at any moment there are at least 33 senators that agree with me, we can stop bad treaties. I don't know, Jack, what the current number is with regard to UNSLOS or any other, but I find that you have to take each individual argument as it arrives in the Senate for consideration. But yeah, over the last few years since I've been here, we have usually been able to stop bad treaties as they're brought to us.
Great. Another question we have is, do you think the sort of, I guess, tradition of giving donors or bundlers such high-profile ambassadorships is a process needs to be changed going forward, given the importance of foreign policy?
Yeah, okay, that is a good question. In essence, now I'm not sure that it's a good idea necessarily to give them to a donor simply because a donor has given a lot of money. That doesn't seem like a great idea to me. I don't know in every circumstance what criteria a president's considering when deciding whether to make somebody an ambassador. And I hope that that doesn't come into play very often, certainly not with any country with which our relationship is really impactful. And I'm sure there are not many places on the planet where our relationship is anything other than impactful. So it's a short way of saying that it's probably not a good way to choose an ambassador. But it is the president who gets to make those decisions with, of course, the advice and consent of the Senate. What I don't like is there is a trend that goes along with that one. There are those who say, well, because some people who have been nominated to be ambassadors have themselves donated money to presidential campaigns, in some cases a little, in some cases a lot, that means that presidents shouldn't make what they derisively refer to as political nominations, and they should instead select them from the existing ranks of career civil service diplomats within the State Department. I don't like this. I don't like that decision, in part because as a a Republican, as a conservative Republican at that, I can tell you that there is a noticeable political leaning within the State Department, and it does not lean to the right. And so those who make this argument very often are just wanting Republican presidents to pick Democrats to carry important ambassadorial roles. I think it's also important to note that there are a lot of people outside the career civil service class within the State Department who can be excellent ambassadors. Some of the best ambassadors who I know and have interacted with, including my former boss, John Huntsman, who has served as our ambassador to Russia most recently, before that to China, and decades before that to Singapore. He did not come out of the State Department, but he's a fantastic ambassador. So anyway, I would rather have presidents making their decisions on the basis of whatever they think is important. Hopefully it's not somebody making donations, but that certainly shouldn't be a disqualifier, nor should it commit us to decades-long practices of nominating only people from within the State Department.
Great. Next question is from Catherine. China just recently publicly stated that the U.S. is not operating from a position of strength. We are exactly 2 months into a Biden presidency, and China already views the U.S. in a weak position. How do we restore our image of strength, or strength in fact, on the world stage for the next 4 years?
Well, I wish we would that we would continue to push back on international bodies like the UN broadly, like the World Health Organization, more specifically, entities on the global stage that have been abused by China to our own detriment, and countries that have tried to legitimize their own actions in that area through these international bodies. If we push back more on those international bodies and also threatened and were prepared to deploy increased trade sanctions on them, I think we'd be in a better position. They've gotten really aggressive in recent months. Just look at what they've done in Hong Kong. Look at what they continue to do in the South China Sea. It's no small matter to claim the South China Sea through these islands, or the shallow waters that they then manufacture into islands. To declare them as their territorial waters is very significant. If in fact their objective is to make those the equivalent, not just of waters off the eastern seaboard, but make them analogous to the Mississippi River on our end, that's a real problem. There's a very substantial percentage of all the world's trade that travels through that area. And I am not convinced that their motives there are pure. Anyway, I hope we will push back hard on China.
And next question up is your colleagues in the House of Representatives, the Republicans especially, have signaled their support for bringing back earmarks. What are your thoughts on this proposal? And do you foresee this having a detrimental effect, and the likelihood that they will be brought back?
I think bringing back earmarks is politically disastrous. I think it is repugnant to the very idea of limited government. I think bringing back earmarks is something that can best be understood as turning, to use a biblical expression, like a dog to its vomit, to a corrupt practice. It's not just that it leads to corruption, it is itself a legal form of corruption. The whole idea of the earmark is to take a bill, a stack of paper that's about to become law, and you throw on specific projects that are going to be funded by the federal government, which, mind you, spends even in a normal non-COVID year something approaching $4 trillion. You throw in these projects that themselves might be worth only a few million or a few tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and you direct that to a particular legislative district or state or business, defense contractor or otherwise. And you load that onto a broader legislative package. That is itself a form of corruption. It's a legal way of effectively bribing particularly affected members of Congress into voting for that piece of legislation. I was elected to the United States Senate for the first time back in 2010. Shortly after I arrived in Washington, the Republican conference in the Senate met, and with my support and in part as a result of agitation by me and other members who had been elected at the same time, we abandoned the practice. And the House of Representatives did the same thing. So why we would want to return to that barbaric, really unpopular, and inherently corrupt system is beyond my ability to understand. Now, there are those of my Republican colleagues and apparently a majority of those casting their votes in the House of Representatives, Republican Conference, who concluded otherwise earlier this week. There are those who want this. And the argument that they always use is along the lines of, well, the Democrats are going to do it anyway, we might as well do it. It's like the person who decides to become a vegan, but then when his friends are eating bacon, they say, well, this pig's already dead, so I'm going to eat this one. But it's much worse than that. I think this will seriously weaken the political credibility of the Republican Party if we take this step. And I cannot signal my disapproval of this too strongly. This is a horrible decision that the House Republicans just made. I sincerely implore them with every fiber of my being to walk that back. I'm not going to let it happen in the Senate.
Great, and we have time for one more question from Matthew. What do you and your colleagues plan to do with the unconstitutional executive orders, such as the decision not to enforce our immigration laws, the violation of the taking clause of the Fifth Amendment, with the shutting down of the XL pipeline, and so forth?
Yeah, great question. All right, on executive orders, this is a tricky question, and but it's a question that you all, as members of the Federalist Society, are able to grasp better than most Americans, given your legal training and what you've learned in law school. Not all executive orders are bad, and not all executive orders are created the same way. Many of them are perfectly constitutional. Let's go back to the three-part test first articulated by Justice Jackson in his classic concurring opinion in Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer. Interestingly enough, that case came out in a year when Justice Jackson had a young law clerk by the name of William Hubbs Rehnquist, who would later serve as Associate Justice and ultimately Chief Justice of the United States. And while Chief Justice Rehnquist was on the Supreme Court and not just a law clerk to Justice Jackson, he brought Justice Jackson's three-part analysis, his three-part test in Youngstown, and made it a majority opinion of the Supreme Court in a 1981 case called Dames and Moore versus Regan. He identified these three areas. You know, you've got some instances in which Congress has delegated, or the Constitution itself delegates a certain amount of power to the executive branch, to the president. Some of the cleaner examples of this might involve things like whenever the president is acting as commander-in-chief. Let's say if the president issues an executive order signaling days in which flags will be flown at half-mast at military installations, quite clearly within his constitutional authority to do that. Where there's a legitimate act of Congress giving the president a specific power, that's also where the president's power is at its highest. It's at its lowest, it's nadir, when Congress has expressly prohibited something, expressly prohibited the president from taking a particular action. And then there's this Twilight Zone, the area, and I think Justice Jackson actually used the word twilight in referring to this. The area in which Congress hasn't spoken, Congress has neither authorized nor prohibited it, but the court just has to figure out whether there's a valid case for the president acting. That's why there are almost as many kinds of executive orders as far as where they fit on the spectrum of constitutional or unconstitutional, as there are different areas in which executive orders can operate. It's really, really hard. One of the examples that you cited in your question was, what do we do about the anticipatory capitulation on the border? That one's deeply disturbing, and that one's really hard to address for the simple reason that it's very hard for us to, in fact, it's impossible, and it probably should be unconstitutional, as it is unconstitutional, for somebody to take the president of the United States to court and to enjoin the president to enforce the law in a particular case. It's very, very difficult to do if you're trying to force the president to undertake an act. In many instances, the president is going to be either immune or can't be served, or the courts aren't going to be able to exercise personal jurisdiction over the president to do that. That's really tough, and that's one of the reasons why presidential elections matter, is that presidents do have the ability to decide how to allocate law enforcement resources. But that one's a particularly troubling one, because it's not one that we ought to simply ignore. President Obama has tried with DACA, and President Biden's administration so far is trying to defend its non-enforcement of immigration laws under the banner of prosecutorial discretion. Now, I'm a former federal prosecutor myself, and I know that prosecutorial discretion is real. It refers, it's a big sounding word that describes a very simple concept, which is, if you're a cop or a prosecutor, you know that you're not going to simultaneously see and be able to enforce the law in every single instance in which there is a violation of the law. So you got to pick and choose. You got to pick your battles. You got to pick which ones make more sense to enforce. But when they claim prosecutorial discretion justifies just the non-enforcement of our laws on the border, that's something entirely different than prosecutorial discretion. In other words, it's one thing to say internally to cops or to prosecutors, okay, these are the kinds of cases we want to prioritize. If we're not going to be able to prosecute federally every bank robbery that involves an FDIC-insured institution, then maybe at least we can prioritize the enforcement of those where the take is at least a certain dollar threshold, and where the person was also carrying a firearm and in violation of one or more additional laws. That's prosecutorial discretion. It's not prosecutorial discretion to say we're not going to enforce laws prohibiting bank robbery. That's de facto nullification. That's lawless. That's one that may well have recourse, not as much in court, but through the political process, through the political branches of government, not just through the next presidential election and every presidential election cycle thereafter, as I would hope, but also through the Congress's allocation of resources. If a certain branch of government, if a certain department in the executive branch of government is going to refuse to enforce the law, maybe we should refuse to provide funding for certain priorities within that department, unless or until they start actually enforcing it to our liking. Those are all resources at our disposal. Keystone XL pipeline is an example of another area where he probably has the raw political power to do what he did, but what he did is horrible. The investment-backed expectations that have gone into this thing The ungodly amount of money that's been invested in this doesn't in any way, it makes it that much more indefensible to simply cancel the project, which will itself further undermine the great position of North American energy independence that we've long sought to attain. Anyway, I'm sorry, this is a long-winded way of saying there is no easy solution. There's no one-size-fits-all cure to the executive order problem. But there are some things that would help. Number one, I, for one, believe that we need to reform things like the National Emergencies Act. This is an area where I parted ways with President Trump. I called him in advance and told him I couldn't support his use of it in some instances because I think the National Emergencies Act, as it's frequently employed, is itself highly constitutionally problematic. And I think we need to reform the National Emergencies Act in a manner that I proposed in legislation called the Article 1 Act. More broadly, I think we need to enact reforms with regulatory policy in the form of the REINS Act and trade policy in the form of the Global Trade Accountability Act, which I've introduced. In both instances, these pieces of legislation would make non-self-executing acts of the executive. The REINS Act, it's any major rule, any new regulation with an economically significant impact would have to be affirmatively enacted by Congress into law before it can take effect. So too with the Global Trade Accountability Act, it would take a whole host of about a dozen or so of these provisions of international trade law where we've just given to the executive the power to start trade wars and say, no, you can't change that. You can't start a trade war without both houses of Congress affirmatively enacting it into law. If I had one shot at passing one piece of legislation at any moment, it would be the REINS Act, because I think it would start to rebalance the deteriorating structural protections we've had in place. You fix either federalism or separation of powers. That move will start healing the other. With the REINS Act, it's separation of powers. Our deviation from separation of powers followed naturally from our deviation from federalism. As Congress got all this power, Congress started to panic and said, we can't do this to ourselves. We'll be enacting too much legislation. We'll be accountable too much. People will be mad at us too frequently. So we delegated it out to the other branches. The REINS Act is the best first step in the right direction, and I think we need to pass it.
Great. I think that's a great way to end it. I know you have such a busy schedule, but thank you for making the time to speak with us today.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And thanks to all of you for joining and supporting the Federalist Society. It's a fantastic entity.
And I guess we'll kick things over to Andrea Leelike, our president of the Penn Law Federalist Society, for closing remarks.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Senator Lee, for your address tonight, a great conclusion to the 40th Annual Federalist Society National Student Symposium. I would also like to thank all of our speakers who provided thoughtful commentary and debate throughout the past 2 days. And a final thank you to all of you who have tuned in, engaged with the multitude of legal questions brought to light during the various panels of this symposium. We look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully in person, at next year's National Student Symposium. Thank you.